And we're live. Okay. So great to have you with me, Nicki. So I just, by way of introduction, I just would love to hear a little bit about you. Just what is just a brief background? You know, you're an actress. I'm not quite sure what you're doing these days because you've gone through a whirlwind adventure, which is probably a considerable understatement. But just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background before we sort of get into the NXIVM of things.
Sure thing. The nexus of the NXIVM things. So I grew up in Vancouver, BC, which I know you are familiar with, and I started my career as an actor. I was very fortunate because the film industry was kind of booming around the time that I got started and was able to get work on TV shows and some movies. And my biggest role to date and what I'm mostly known for is for playing Callie on Battlestar Galactica, which was a dream job. I mean, I didn't know what I was walking into at the time. I know that Battlestar Galactica had a huge following from the show in the 70s. Dare I say, a cult following. And
Accurate.
Yeah. Exactly. And I just really lucked out in landing that role. And then my role grew throughout the series until, spoiler alert, an unfortunate ending in the final season. But I had a good run. I had just an incredible experience on the show. At the same time, I also studied at university. I never felt like it was enough for me to just be an actor. You know, like I always loved learning and just.
What did you study?
I studied a lot of different things. I think because I had a career as an actor, I didn't have the same pressure to get a degree in order to get a job. And so I jumped around a lot. I went to 4 different college/universities. I studied philosophy, psychology, religion, film, communications, advertising, journalism, just things I was interesting, obviously more so in the arts. I didn't like so much like when you had to take the statistics classes for psychology and whatnot. And much to the chagrin of my mother, I never finished my degree, but I have continued to be a student of life, as cheesy as that sounds. But I really feel that way. And I feel like there are many ways to learn and to grow, and academia is one of those ways. But I've certainly learned the most through just being thrown into the center of an impossible situation and trying to navigate it with integrity, with grace, with, being the kind of person that I can look back on and be proud of. So in 2005, I was introduced to executive success programs by Sarah Edmondson. And I mention her just because it's kind of ironic that she's become the ambassador for everything anti-NXIVM. And she's the one who introduced me to the program because she was so enthusiastic. I honestly was not looking for personal growth in that way. Like I said, my studies were more theoretical, academic. I was not, I'd never done therapy or especially not any type of been part of any type of group. I wasn't really into that. But what she pitched to me and the way that she was in a conversation that we had was compelling enough for me to say, you know what? I don't know anything about this, but if it's as good as what you say, then it sounds like it could really benefit me. And if it's not, then I lose, 5 days and some money. And at the time I was, making good money. I had kind of all the things materially, and I was open to ways that I might be able to improve my quality of life internally and externally. So I took this intensive with Executive Success Programs, or ESP, which I know is a funny acronym because it has nothing to do with anything mystical whatsoever. And I really liked it. And I found that it brought a very practical approach to understanding why we do what we do as humans, like in general. So, my interest in psychology as well as philosophy, and then questioning, on an individual level, questioning like your definitions of things and beliefs that you have that maybe don't serve you anymore. And sometimes these beliefs are very buried because we develop our belief system before we have cognition and logic. So, as we get older, if we don't challenge those things, we walk around with a kind of an operating system, if you will, that has bugs. Sorry, I know it's a cheesy metaphor, but it's true. And because we're smart, because as we grow up, we develop intellect, more often than not, we'll just develop better and better excuses, justifications, rationalizations for our fears and inconsistent beliefs, rather than looking at them and exposing them and adopting a more reality adaptive belief system. So I guess, long story short, like I said, I loved the program. I ended up becoming a coach. Over time, I got more involved with the company and, not just for my own benefit, and it benefited me tremendously as an actor, in my relationships, specifically my relationship with my dad. And, but I loved helping people. Like, it was a way that I could help people get to know themselves better, see parts of themselves that they'd kind of hidden or judged. And it's just a beautiful thing to watch someone kind of take back a part of themselves or express a part of themselves that they hadn't maybe since they were a kid. And to me, that's such a gift. So I was very moved by the tools and how they could help people. And I also liked the people because it obviously attracted a type of person who was willing to introspect and wanted to make the world a better place. So I became friends with people, and I ended up starting a media company in 2015 with a few friends, where we analyzed news and developed a metric for exposing the amount of spin, slant, and logic that articles had. Like, we would analyze the top stories of the news for each day and take articles from, trying to take kind of like a slice from like BBC, Fox, New York Times, like a kind of a range, and we would give readers the metrics of how spun they were, how slanted, all the ways that they juxtapose things or left things out. That's more the slant. And then the logic, where they drew illogical conclusions in their coverage. And then we would also
still around?
Sadly, it's one of the companies that got destroyed with everything else when this whole kind of, I call it a hate campaign, like this media campaign to destroy not just Keith and the leadership of NXIVM, but basically everyone who was ever involved and anything that Keith ever helped create. It's really sad because it was actually starting to get traction. Elon Musk was tweeting about it. A lot of big influencers on Twitter from both sides of the aisle were sharing the stories. And I mean, it's needed. It's something that's needed more than ever. So,
yeah.
But anyway, so I did that. But then in 2017 was when this attack started, where some people inside NXIVM. It's funny to talk about it because I feel like sometimes I've adopted words and lingo like from the narrative that we never used. For example, like we didn't really ever use the word NXIVM, but like that's become synonymous. Well, NXIVM was like the name of the whole community and group, I guess, of companies. So, for example, there was a monthly NXIVM newsletter. But in terms of membership, people weren't members of NXIVM. There was executive success programs, like I mentioned, which was the main company. It had over 17,000 people that took programs over the years. And that was really the thing that people were a part of for the most part. And then there were a few other companies as well. But anyway, I guess I just use like NXIVM for short because that's what people know. And unfortunately, it's become synonymous with cult or worse, sex cults.
Well, you know, it's interesting that we're even having this conversation in a way because, you know, as even if as you were describing the organization that you were involved with, you know, I'm the most allergic person to this stuff. Like, I was sort of forced to go to something similar, which is the Landmark Forum, and you know, I was forced to go to an introductory session, and I'm just the most, you know, skeptical outsider kind of person. And I also know, as you know, I know Sarah. I shared a cab with her at some point as she was going to Albany, and she was telling me about what is now known as NXIVM. And you know, obviously didn't know the whole details at the time. She told me how great it was, and then at some point I started hearing these rumors that this was a cult, and I had said, and I said something at a party. So I made a joke, I think kind of intentionally to provoke. And I said, oh, I run a cult of my own. You know, it's called Katherinology, which I kind of do, but I like to joke about it. Sure. And she heard me say it and probably did think it was a little bit of a shot at her. So she said, so she turned around and she said, you know, me too. But if you mean by cult, like an organization that helps people, you know, and
right.
So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then with everything sort of coming out later on, which I really didn't know all those details. But, you know, I definitely like anything that's organized, I'm very allergic to. I do have a friend that was kind of part of it. So I do have a different take on it. But when I started talking to you, and I think I was probably trying to push your buttons a little bit, what surprised me about you was that you were so open, so willing to engage, and were willing to engage with me, sort of pushing your buttons and you know, being a little bit more critical. And so I was like, okay, well, she's certainly thinking for herself at the very least. And so maybe she sees things in a very different way than I do, which is okay. Because, you know, it's okay. I see things differently. But also that's what made me kind of interested in having this conversation with you, because, and I guess we'll kind of get to that, because I think, I think when I come to something like that, you know, I have sort of a healthy way of looking at it, that I don't think I'm as prone to, say, being taken advantage of if I come, you know, if I came across a cult, you know, that, and I'm not even going to say like NXIVM is a cult right now. I'm just going to say, let's take a bona fide cult, you know. Yeah. I notice certain behavior, and I'm just very quick to respond to that. But there are people who are more vulnerable, and I guess that to me is what makes it kind of an interesting discussion about sort of where people's vulnerabilities are, because to me, and even with somebody like Sarah, and I don't want to go too much into talking about a specific person, but like, you know, somebody's in a position of leadership, right? And then also somebody who then sees themselves as a victim. I think that's kind of an interesting an interesting story, you know?
It should raise more red flags than it does, in my opinion. And yeah, I mean, I think we can talk about that without, making it personal. And it is something interesting about this story, because I honestly don't know what I would think if I read about it. Like I think I would probably think what you do. And I don't know enough, because we haven't talked like at length about, about our individual perspectives on it. But like I said, I was never someone who was like a joiner. I had lots of different friend groups. I wasn't looking for community. I've always been very independent in my thinking, and been okay being different. So I wasn't looking to belong to something. And honestly, when I took my first training with ESP, well, actually, you'll appreciate this story. I don't know if I told you, but so I had this conversation with Sarah, and I really liked what she said, and she seemed different to me. Like we had a much more superficial relationship. We were both actors in Vancouver. We'd go to film festival parties, and I found her kind of neurotic and superficial. And in this conversation, after she'd done ESP, she was asking me deep questions and actually listening. And I was like, wow, I really like that. I like these questions. Not many people probe in this way, and they're challenging me, and it was emotional. And I was like, I like this. If this is what you learned, that seems interesting to me. But, the salesperson that she is, she needed me to sign the app within 24 hours so she could get a discount, and And I didn't like that. I'm very allergic to salesy stuff too. And intellectually, I think sales is important and it's good, but it's just how I feel. I'm like, as soon as it feels salesy to me, I'm like, no, I don't want to, I can't even hear you. So, but look, she's my friend. I decided to trust her, and I signed the app. And then she organized this big intro presentation in Vancouver, and she got all like people in the film industry to come. She rented a hotel, and she got Mark Vicente. No, sorry, Mark Vicente wasn't, he was just starting as well, like right before Sarah. So they had these people speak at the intro presentation. And I can't tell you, I was like, I want my deposit back. Like, these people are not my people. They didn't speak well. My mom's an English teacher, so I just grew up like, at least know how to speak
Verbalize.
Well, right? Well, communicate. Exactly. Like, that's something that's just like in my DNA. And the presenters, they were using this like archaic, what do you call it? Clip art, to show how we only use certain percentage of the brain, and how much do you, and I'm like, what is this BS? Like, I really was distraught, and I begged Sarah to get me my money back. And she said she couldn't get me the money back, and to just trust her, that not everyone was like that, it wasn't maybe an accurate representation, whatever. She convinced me to just, stay the course. And I ended up going to this 5-day intensive. And there were a lot of things that I was like, this is weird, or these people are not my people. Because this was way before anyone else like my age. I think I was one of the first actors with any resume to take the course. And it was in a like building where the building, and quite honestly, and no offense to anyone who was there, like, it was like everything was stuck in the 90s, like it was not impressive or flashy or any of the ways that some of the media stories try to represent it. But I'll tell you this, I loved the education. The tools, like when you sat down and you asked yourself these questions, and there were the coaches, again, like, they didn't necessarily come from impressive backgrounds, and they weren't necessarily people that I would, cross paths with in my life otherwise, but they're reading the notes, they're facilitating the groups. It's very straightforward, and it made sense to me. There was no mysticism.
Having studied like psychology and have taken all these courses, philosophy that you have, do you feel like you really needed that structure of these coaches that, probably have not spend like that much time learning these things, as opposed to maybe people have dedicated their whole lives, studying these disciplines?
Well, to me, that was kind of the beauty of it, is that in order to facilitate the classes and the groups, and the trainers, of course, were much more experienced, but because the questions were on the page and the ways of like helping people explore for themselves, which really that's what it was about. It wasn't about like giving an answer or leading people a certain way. It was about continuing to ask the question. And sometimes you'd bring, Venn logic into it, or I can't emphasize how powerful just continuing to ask someone questions to help them go deep inside themselves and figure out, like, is that really what I think? Or does that even make sense? And the curriculum was set up in such a way that you go through this sequential process, and it just brings things to the surface that when you read a book, like reading a book and learning, in school is deductive, whereas this education was inductive, where you're kind of like just asking questions and finding your way. And then you have these like aha realizations, like, oh my God, I can't believe I used to think this, but that's not true. But because you come to it on your own, it's not a teacher or even a therapist saying like, oh, well, you have these dependency patterns because when you were a child, your parents did or didn't do this, which can make sense intellectually, but you don't internalize it. And my experience with these tools was that you could transform, how you experienced things internally and come away from a class or from, a session with a coach and really feel different and see the world differently in a much more freeing and resourceful way. So it was really just the practicality of it. It was almost like if you took like the philosophy and psychology and like Socratic questioning and mixed it with Eastern philosophy and created interactive exercises of actually internalizing those things. And without having to go live in a monastery or something.
So given that, so that sounds interesting, but at the same time, I guess my skeptic mind goes, okay, you've got some useful tools potentially, but at the same time, you've got this motivation to maybe meet quotas, retain people. There's certain verbiage that people might use to sort of almost guilt trip you into, well, if you want to leave, you're not dedicated enough. I mean, granted, I've had an acting teacher who once said that to me because I was unhappy with some of the training methodology, and he said, well, you're just it's a problem within you, right? You're the problem, not me. And I think that is something that happens within many of these organizations, including, I believe, this one. And there are quotas to be met, and there's financial incentives. And like, say, Scientology, you've got sort of this kind of the celebrity appeal. So this kind of commercial enterprise of it all. How do you kind of resign those kind of elements within the training?
Well, I mean, I didn't become a salesperson. So I didn't like, I guess the thing is you can have that type of culture within any company. And I think it's interesting where we view it as bad or abusive and where it's just normal. Because I think every company that wants to succeed and thinks they have a good product that really helps people, they're going to do everything they can to motivate people to sell it, to promote it, to, get people to adopt whatever it is.
But it's different when it's something emotional, because I think when you're selling a product that's like, a laptop or something like that, versus here you're kind of dealing with people's emotions and their state of being, which I do think is a little bit different.
How so?
How so? Well, you're dealing with people's, I can see how, a salesperson might manipulate someone to some extent to maybe sell them the laptop, because they'll try to be like, well, you really need it. It will make you.
We're always buying emotionally
but
at the end of the day. Like if you read any book on sales, or even how people make decisions, we choose emotionally and then we justify it intellectually after, for the most part. So I think that you're talking more about like what the product is and whether the intentions behind it are good, and whether there perhaps were like built-in kind of mechanisms or teachings that were more about helping the company than the individual. Like, is that kind of maybe what you're thinking about,
for example, if somebody's trying to sell me a laptop, right? You mentioned to me you bought a new MacBook Pro. I'm not sharing with the salesperson. I'm not sharing my deepest secrets or emotions. Whereas, if I'm part of this group, or even if I'm in an acting class, right, you are sharing things that are deeper, more personal. And so those can be used as tools to maybe manipulate somebody into buying the product, right? And that's a little bit different, I think, than when somebody's trying to sell you like a dream, as advertising campaigns often do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suppose anything can be abused, and I think what you're saying can and does happen. And whether it's acting classes, whether it's organizations, and it's very possible that it happened in ESP. I don't think just because it can happen, it mean it does, or that it did. And I think the teachings in ESP really promoted ethics and integrity, and even the amount of sales type teachings that were in some of the courses. What it taught is that sales is about finding out if there's a match of values. So if someone doesn't have the value of personal growth, of moving beyond certain limitations they experience, or maybe feels they don't have limitations, then this is not for them. And that, to me, that makes sense to me. And why would you want someone to be involved in something that doesn't serve them, or that, they don't feel is beneficial to them? So it's definitely not like, I never felt that I tried to, pressure someone or bring someone in who wouldn't want it. Like, there were definitely people I thought would benefit from the courses, and they didn't want to, and like, that's fine. But it's interesting, again, like, not to make it personal, but the people who are the most anti now, Sarah, Mark, Barbara Boucher, and others, they were the most salesy in the organization. They had the biggest organizations. They brought the most people in, and they were the people after every course who would come find you and say, did you sign up for the next one? Did you do this? Did you do that? And, think what you will. Like, I agree. It's not my style. I didn't like it. Sometimes when people do that, my tendency is to do the opposite, even if deep down I want to, or it would be good for me, because I'm kind of defiant too. But so I'm not saying that wasn't a thing, but it doesn't mean the tools were bad. It doesn't mean the organization was set up that way. I think in any company and in any entity that has a sales team, you're going to find people who use persuasion and maybe prioritize the sale over the person. I will tell you, my experience of the company itself and the teachings was that it did not promote that, and promoted the opposite.
What do you think caused the more salesy people to sort of turn? Because you obviously, as the documentary came out and all the media headlines, you watched that happen. Those were people who are quite high up in the company. They were very deeply intertwined in it. Kind of were sort of you would think were sort of believers, and really turned, right? What do you think was the reason that happened?
So without doing a whole psychological analysis on each person, and without sharing things that I know personally about them, which honestly, that's a tough one for me, because personal things have been shared about me without my permission, but I don't, once you get in the mud, everyone's, I don't know what that quote is. Everyone's full of mud, whatever. Like
everyone becomes a pig.
Like that. But I will say that it became obvious that a lot of that people were involved in the organization for different reasons. And I think when some people were met with a considerable amount of adversity, and that meant people close to them pressuring them to make other choices. That meant things coming out in the media. That meant financial pressures. That some people who were in leadership positions and some who were not were put in a very difficult position of either standing by what they knew to be true, their experience, risking their reputations, their livelihoods, and things like that, and people chose to protect themselves and throw people that they had been friends with, worked with, cared for, allegedly, for 15 years under the bus. And I think it's different for each person. Everyone has their own story, but to generalize, that's how I feel.
It seems like some people genuinely see themselves as victims in this, right? And I think with you, you don't. And I'm kind of curious about that perspective, because even looking at something like the mark, right? That's something that's been really sensationalized in the media, rightly or wrongly. You can kind of look at it from various perspectives, right? You can look at it as, well, you agreed to it, you knew what that agreement was, and you made that choice, and willingly, even if you gave collateral, that collateral was also given willingly as something to kind of hold you accountable. So that's one way of looking at it. And the other way of looking at it is, well, you were sort of in a vulnerable position, felt pressured because you're part of this group, and the collateral now is kind of over your head, so you have no escape even if you change your mind. So there's two really, I think both are somewhat legitimate ways to look at it. I mean, I would personally never choose to do that, but someone could also choose to do that. So, and people choose to be, some people look at something like a BDSM relationship and cringe and are completely disgusted with it, and other people are like, that's their thing. So it's kind of understandable, but why do you think, for you look at it as a completely consensual thing where you're sort of willing to maybe give that power away and not see yourself as a victim, but as an empowered person, I imagine, and other people look at it in a different way? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing that I want to clarify. So you spoke about the mark or the brand, which has been totally scandalized. It was basically like a tattoo that ends up like a scar that fades, and it was from people who have both, tattoos and the brand, I think no more painful. I don't have tattoos, but it wasn't this idea of
extremely painful to them, right? So it's hard to understand
people have different pain thresholds. For me, I've had dental work that is 10 times more painful than getting the brand, but I don't think that doesn't mean I think anyone should undergo any pain that they don't consent to ever. So the thing with DOS is that in order to join, you first had to give some sort of collateral as a surety that you would keep what you learned about the organization a secret. And that was to protect people's privacy. It was meant to be this secret sorority of women. Men have secret societies. I don't know of any women's secret societies. I hope they exist. But my experience has told me that maybe we haven't earned it yet. Anyway, so women chose first to hear about it and give this collateral as a surety, and they gave it to a trusted friend. This isn't like people on the street saying like, hey, give me this thing. This was between friends who'd known each other for years and years and also understood the concept of collateral, that it would never be used in an abusive or harmful way, that it was like just to guarantee that the person who wanted to learn about the organization would keep it a secret. And it was both to protect, people in the sorority and the secrecy of it, and to give the person giving it an experience of backing their word, because it's not often that we do that in life. We make promises, we make commitments all the time, and sadly, we break them, and that hurts us. So it's like an exercise in really saying, you know what, I know that I'm never going to share this, and I'm so certain that I'm willing to give this over to you, and I know you won't abuse it. And then once someone learned about it, about what DOS was, what the relationship was, that it was about extreme accountability and having this lifelong mentorship of, pushing through fears, having someone to say like, wait a minute, you said you would do this, and really like a loving person by your side who's your friend, but who's going to give you honest feedback and really like, push you. And not everyone wants that. I invited someone who's like someone I care for deeply. I still do. And I thought she would like it. She said no. That was the end of it. Like I said, I would never, ever want someone to make any type of commitment, but certainly one as serious as that, if they didn't want it and if they didn't really understand what it was. So women, before they joined, they knew about the brand. They knew about that we used master slave terminology, which for the record does not mean slavery. It like voluntarily making a commitment does not mean that. It was meant to be provocative, to kind of explore the meanings of those things and essentially learn to surrender. It's not easy, to surrender, but ultimately you find yourself underneath letting go of control, or at least that's what I believe.
For example, in like a BDSM relationship, if somebody wants out, there is an exit. You change your mind, you can exit. But if you gave away collateral, you can't really exit, essentially. So you have no way of really changing your mind. And I can understand why you might not want that exit in a way, because it kind of holds your feet to the fire. But at the same time, it does create, if maybe, people aren't perfect, and your friend may turn out to be not like maybe ultimately the right person to trust. So what happens then?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because the collateral was never held over someone to do something, to be perfect, or like I'm addressing one part of what you're saying, and then I'll address what you're saying about a master perhaps having issues. But I want to make it clear that like people's collateral was basically like put away and never touched again. And it was more the symbolic and the experiential, gesture of saying like, no, I want you to hold me accountable. I'm in this. I want to push myself. I want to grow. I want to face my fears. And people were asked to do things or failed on the plans that they created themselves all the time, because that's part of growing, is you fail. But the thing that was different in DOS is that when you failed, you didn't quit. You didn't make up excuses and say like, well, actually I want this other shiny object over here, or actually no, I can't do it. It's like, no, how are you gonna overcome that limitation or that weakness, or prove to yourself that you can show up? It was much more about a process than any specific thing being done or not done. And then in terms of, like you said, like, what if, your friend turns out to, maybe they're not, using that authority in a good way, or maybe someone isn't fit to be, understand the responsibility of guiding someone in that way. And we were in the process of developing a whole kind of ethics board and system where if someone joined and they felt like they weren't, having a good experience, there were other people that they could speak to, and that it wouldn't get personal, or their master wouldn't know. So those were all things we were sensitive to. We only started, though, with a very small group of trusted friends. So it's not like we had people at the very beginning of like that we didn't know or that we didn't trust. Now, having said all of that, in hindsight, I think there should have been more barriers to entry. I think people should have been tested more before given certain authority or before joining. I think a lot of things should have been different. But I don't think any of the failures or the mistakes warrant the type of punishment and destruction and condemnation that the people who were involved have experienced. And I think it was something that could have all been sorted out. Like, people could have gone to their master and said, like, this is kind of bullshit, and I don't like this anymore, and I want to leave. And guess what? That happened. What happened? Nothing. It was sad. It was like, damn, like, wow, we need to think more about like, who we let in, because we don't want someone to make that type of commitment and then break it, because that's bad for their own, internal world. But no one was ever threatened. People left. And then when things started coming out in the media and people just didn't want to deal with being associated, people left and nothing happened. No one was ever threatened. No one's collateral was ever released by us.
Do you think people are afraid at times because of sort of more the power structures? Like, it's not necessarily that there is like a direct threat to them, but there is a perception of it because, and it might just be emotional, right? Like it, for example, Keith was kind of seen in this regarded, he had, a title, right? Vanguard, and he was sort of elevated.
Well, when you put it that way, or when you say it like that, no, but like, I guess, but that was only within ESP. People had titles the same way. It's funny. I was listening to a Twitter space the other night, and people who were coming up to ask questions, they'd say congressman and congresswoman. Like, we have titles. It doesn't mean that you look to these people as superior beings. It's a sign of respect. But outside of ESP,
he created the title for himself, right? I mean, no. I wouldn't create a title. Well, how?
No, he actually didn't. It was part of the initial team, like Nancy and others, who started creating the curriculum and the modules or the classes, and they came up with titles. I don't think he came up with it. I
wouldn't go, hey, call me like I have an ego, but I would be like, listen, don't call me that. I would feel very weird. So I do think it does speak a little bit.
Would you say that, like, if you became a judge,
yeah,
would you tell everyone in your court that not to call you Your Honor?
No, because that's a system that has existed for a long period of time. I guess I would buy into that system, and I would have people call me Your Honor, but only in a court setting. Yeah.
Right. And outside of a classroom, an ESP classroom, Keith was Keith, or whatever people wanted to call him, but he was Keith. He never asked people
but
to
I
call
do
him
think
anything.
when people are elevated to this in this way, and this happens again, I don't think it happens just in ESP. Like, I think it happens, like I said, with acting teachers, with professors, with anybody who sort of has a lot of, I would say, like, let's call it fandom. And it's not necessarily always like there because of them, right? People do start treating them differently. And
I agree with
and
that.
it does create a certain power dynamic. Now, that's in some ways unavoidable, right? Because
people, there are always going to be people. I mean, I experienced that just being on a TV show. People
right, yeah,
treat you different, and
they do.
I forget, and then I'm like, oh wait, they think of me a certain way because I was on TV, and so yeah, that's absolutely true. And you're always going to find that in any organization, or anytime someone's in a leadership position or position of influence.
So are
But
there responsibilities that come with that? So for example,
yeah,
if you're okay, we can look at it in the context of a school or a professor, right? I think a professor, for example, shouldn't sleep with their students because they're in a position, and it would make other students uncomfortable, but also the students are under their tutelage, and there is a power kind of inequality. Now, if they're no longer their students, it's a different situation. So I think when it comes to this kind of dynamic, especially when people really look to you almost like in a spiritual capacity, would there not be the similar kind of constraint of having that kind of responsibility to draw limits?
I think there should be. And I think that it's not black or white, though, because Keith wasn't a teacher in the school. Like, he wasn't he obviously founded the company, and people knew who he was, but he wasn't directly involved in like teaching or coaching people. I think that obviously age appropriate 100%. So like in a student teacher setting, that's a factor. But I also think once you become an adult, like, we are responsible for our decisions. And I think that it's interesting how our society picks and chooses, like, what is like not okay power dynamic and what is. Like, I think Bill Gates, met his wife. She worked at the company. Not to use him as like a pillar of like what's right, but like no one is like, oh well, he abused her, and he abused his power for that relationship. I think that it's very individual, and there are people who abuse their power in those positions. Absolutely. I did not witness or experience Keith to do that. So I think, and I know people do, and I know kind of the issue I have with it is they didn't until they did. And that's what's tricky about it, is like, if someone is in a relationship, and look, we've all had relationships where it was awesome and then it ended in some maybe bad way, and then we like go back and we make everything about the relationship bad because it's just easier. Like, it feels easier than to look back and be like, actually I really loved them, but it's not meant to be for whatever reason, or maybe there were good things and bad things. And so I just don't think it's fair or right that people can be all one way, or at least enough one way that they are consenting and, in a relationship or part of a group or whatever. and they express their enthusiastic consent, as I think they say in the BDSM community, or consent, about consent, and but then later say, oh no, none of it was my decision, I was coerced the whole time, I have no responsibility. I just don't think that's fair. I'm okay with people thinking Keith is wrong for having relationships with people who were part of the organization. Like, they can disagree with that, but it's not a crime. And right. I just think it's the fact that one, it's very common in many different places. Like, rock stars sleep with people all the time. We're fine with it. They're rock stars. That's what they do. Actors, celebrities, whatever. People do that. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying they're not in prison. So the fact that Keith has been so demonized, and his conduct of having multiple relationships over 10 years, 50, like long-term relationships. It's not like he was just sleeping with people, not at all. That to me, in a lot of ways, we accept guys cheating on women before we accept them having multiple relationships that are honest and open. And I think that's inconsistent and a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is a lot of grays here, and I do think that it's a tricky thing, because there are many instances where somebody might say, hey, they seem to consent, or at least don't voice any discontent. They sort of go, they consent to the relationship, and perhaps several times. So there's no way of knowing that they're uncomfortable with it, and then they change their mind. So you kind of have to have some kind of a standard before you prosecute someone for it. So it is really tricky, but and there has been a huge focus in this story specifically on the the sex cult aspect of it, which it's I kind of get it. Of course, that's salacious, but I do wonder, do you think there's something beyond the fact that it's so salacious that has been the focus of this in the media?
Well, I think that the people behind the crafting of the narrative and who've profited from it in different ways, I think they just knew that's a dagger. Like, that is, no matter what the facts are about the story, you hear sex cult and you want nothing to do with it. It's repulsive. Like, maybe there's some people who are like, ooh, sex cult, depending on who they think is in it. But for the most part, it's a very, it incites a lot of negative emotions. And my experience has been that once people hear that term and they who knows what they imagine, because there's no definition. Actually, you know what? If you Google sex cults, you know what you find?
What do you find? This
NXIVM.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's like this recursive, non-defined thing. And look, there are groups that I've read about where sex is part of kind of like the reason people are coming together, or like it's a big part of the group. That was not the case at all. Like, people have conflated separate companies and organizations that Keith was either, had a hand in founding or helped people grow, and then his personal relationships. And I understand there's gray area because people were involved. Some women, grown women, were involved in both. And I totally fine for people to have opinions about that. But that would mean that any man who has companies and has relationships is running a sex cult. And that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a frequent discussion because there is this sense of like, well, if you're a powerful, especially with the whole Me Too thing, is like if you're a powerful man, you can't really have a relationship with anybody really in the industry because, you know, you are in a position of power. And I do kind of push back on that particular thing because, like, well, where are you going to meet people, right?
Right. Well, yeah, because like, of course, and then you want to be with someone who like speaks your language, so to speak, or shares your values, or that you can connect with, that you have things in common with. So I don't know, and I also think, just like speaking of irrational tendencies that we have, I think in the discourse, is like, why do we always view women as default victims? Because women get a lot out of being with powerful men. Like, why is it that if a young woman, old enough, of course, but a young woman who doesn't have a lot of experience or money or whatever dates an older man and he gives her all kinds of stuff, and let's say they have a relationship, but then he ends it, we think she's a victim, that she was taken advantage of. But like, why? What about all the stuff she got?
Yeah, I've definitely seen it going both ways. I mean, there was someone when the Weinstein thing went down, there was the rumor mill was working overtime, and people are saying, even in Canada, it's like, who's the guy who, and I won't name, but who's the equivalent in Canada?
Oh, really?
And yeah, and they named
Ooh, I
someone
want to
who I
know
know
now.
is, I am not going to say it, certainly, because that's just so mean. And the person is not at all, but I would see this
Hmm.
person surrounded by young women all the time, right? And they
Hmm.
would surround him. Maybe I don't even think he like really took advantage of it because he is not wasn't 100% his thing, but like, um, but these women were throwing themselves at him. He wasn't a predator. So to say that sort of thing was, you know, if he had slept with any of them, that's not, it was consensual. So to kind of peg him in that way was just really awful, I think. And, you know, but I've also, you know, having been in the film industry myself, like certainly have been approached by many men and, you know, who tried to manipulate me. I'm just not very, a very good target for them. But you know, it happens, but I'm also like I'm able to say no, you know, and I weirdly knew a lot of men who were on the whole Me Too list, and
Hmm.
luckily haven't been the you know, I'm okay, but
Yeah.
but some people aren't, you know, and so it happens, but it also happens the other way around where women are you know, I've certainly, like I said, seen women throw themselves at these same men. I had one famous director who, like, you know, full on proposition me, named names of women who slept with him who are famous actresses, and I very strongly turned him down in a very blunt manner.
Good for
Weirdly enough,
you.
he still wanted to be friends with me, surprisingly. But on that same night, a married woman went home with him, you know?
Wow.
So
Yeah.
that's how it works.
And that's the thing. And uh, obviously I was in Hollywood, so I've had those experiences, and I I do empathize with women who've either been approached or propositioned in a setting where it's not appropriate, and I've had that happen. And I remember one time, like, I thought a director was sincerely interested in me as a person, and he might have been,
Yeah.
but he was also interested in more, and I stopped it.
Mhm.
And it was very emotional for me after, and I was like, did I do something wrong? Like, how could I not see it coming? Like, I do empathize with that, but I think we're having the wrong conversation, because blaming men, demonizing any man who does express his desires, that's not going to solve, if anything. And the fact that, a man can get canceled for like expressing himself or making advances, or maybe going through with something that a woman appears to be on board with, and then later she says she wasn't. That we're just taking so many steps backwards as women. I think the conversation we need to be having is like, why don't we feel comfortable being honest? Why do we use our sexuality to get things and then act surprised when men think we want to have sex with them? Why do, like there are a lot of ways and that we interact as men and women that contribute to these dynamics. And I think we need to be able to have grown-up conversations about our fears, our wants, our beliefs. And I think for women especially, like a lot of women, and I know I felt this way when I was younger, like we feel more valuable when a man is interested in us. Like it feels good. And I think it just feels good on a human level, and that's not bad. But then when we feel like we need it, but then we don't want to give up what then we have to give up when someone's interested in us. Like if we could focus more on like, why don't we feel okay regardless?
Well, and
we'd have a
also,
lot more
how do
freedom.
we and also I think empowering women to be able to say no comfortably, and not have it be such a big deal. Because I think a lot of times it's also comes from like this fear of saying no and coming across like you're rude, or I think a lot of times we just don't even know how to do it. So we kind of are polite and giggly and so because we just don't know how to deal with that attention. And I know that for
100%.
myself, I don't always know how, because I want to be this like fun, easygoing person. And so, it's actually easier in a way when somebody's super blunt with me like that.
Right, because then you can address it instead of being like,
yeah,
okay, we're going out for drinks. Is this a date? Is there
exactly?
like
I don't want to
is
insult
this?
anyone,
Yeah,
right? Because maybe he just wants to be my friend, right? And I'm going to insult by assuming these things. But when it's more direct, it's easier for me to be like direct back. I don't mind being like, I don't want to like string anybody along. But if I'm but I'm happy to be direct if the person is direct with me. So I think we just need to be a little bit more honest with each other, forthcoming, and be okay with like, listen, I'm not interested in you in that way, and that's okay. But I like you, and being okay with like, listen, I do like you as a friend, and if you don't want to be my friend, that's okay
not
too.
what you want. That's cool, but at least have that on the table. 100%.
Yeah, and I think women do struggle, and it can be a difficult thing when you're in an industry where, I mean, I have a lot of men where I know that they're like interest, where I do think it sort of hindered my career in certain instances because I knew they were interested, so I couldn't ask for favors, I couldn't do anything because I was like, well, I know that if I
then you
ask,
might feel like you owe something, or
I don't feel like I owe anything because I know
or they might
that's
think
not how
that
it
you're
works.
interested.
I just know that the reason they would do it is for the wrong reason. So I don't want to ask them, right? So that's where because I just have these particular values that are important to me. But I think what's interesting to me with this whole story is also so there's been, I think there is this consensus that everybody's completely guilty, that and you've been fighting this in the court, so maybe I would love to get a little bit of a brief sort of update on that, because it seems like the court case isn't quite over yet.
Correct.
Where are we at with that?
So the court case is, and just for people who don't know, Keith was indicted on charges of sex trafficking, forced labor, racketeering, and all those same things with the word conspiracy with it. And Nancy Salzman, Lauren Salzman, Allison Mack, Claire Bronfman, and Kathy Russell were also indicted. And they were all going to fight. they were all going to go to trial and I was part of those conversations because I had to hire a lawyer too. I wasn't sure what my situation was going to be. And we all knew it wasn't true. Like I said, maybe there were misunderstandings, maybe mistakes were made, but we were certain that we hadn't committed crimes, and actually even hired an outside group to come and a private investigative group to come in and interview everyone and find out what happened and tell us if any laws had been broken. And they said absolutely not. But it wasn't until the government magically discovered what they called child pornography on a hard drive that they claimed was Keith's, and they brought forth this superseding indictment of child porn, which of course is an awful crime. And that's when all the co-defendants took plea deals or pled, because you can't go to trial with someone accused of something of that nature. And that was the only hard evidence linked to a charge in the entire case. Everything else was based on testimony and kind of the two side perspectives that you described earlier of like, you can see yourself as not a victim, you chose these things, it either was what you thought or it wasn't, but like you're a grown adult and you deal with it, or you were coerced and you're a victim and you were forced to do things that you didn't want to do. And that was how they framed the entire case, that like all these women, I honestly think they indicted before they investigated, and they thought it would be a Harvey Weinstein because it was right after. And I think they thought that once they got Keith, that all these women would go, me too, me too, me too, me too, me too. And no one did. So no one did. So they started serving everyone in the community subpoenas, bringing people in, people that I'm still friends with, women who were part of DOS went in and spoke to the government, and they were bullied. And the government, when I say the government, the prosecutor Moira Penza and FBI agents basically terrorized them, saying, oh, but this, and you must have been scared of this, and weren't you afraid of this, and how could you have wanted to do this, and like judging all of their decisions. And like, I admire them so much for their strength of standing up and saying, no, like, that's not what it was. I wanted to be, in those situations. I benefited from them, and they stood by their story or their experience.
What about that woman that was locked or was alleged to have been locked?
Was in an unlocked room and waited on hand and foot for 18 months.
Is that what? Okay.
Yeah. So that's interesting because she was in Albany like 10 years before like the other stuff that got brought into the case happened. But because the government used RICO, they were able to take all of these like random things and make it a criminal conspiracy, because none of the things either would have, I think, they wouldn't have been able to prosecute because of the statute of limitations otherwise, and they wouldn't have risen to the level of any sort of federal crime. So she just quickly, if people watched the documentary, she was stealing stuff from the company. She stole thousands of dollars. She was there with her family from Mexico, and they were struggling with how to deal with her because she was kind of a liability on the community. And Keith advised them to make some sort of agreement where she had privileges taken away. Basically, she got grounded as I think, 21-year-old. And instead of doing what she agreed to do in order to earn her privileges back, which was, I think, write a book report or write some sort of plan to fix the things that she had done, she stayed in the room for 18 months in her family's home while her family brought her organic vegetarian meals every day and basically, waited on her.
Could she leave if she wanted to?
Yeah, the door was unlocked, and she snuck out the window sometimes and came back at night.
Okay. So that's really interesting because you're basically this because you hear certain things, right? And then you
I
hear
get it.
another perspective.
Yeah.
It becomes very difficult. And this is the case for so many things, right? It becomes very difficult to know what to believe because, you were there, you sort of experienced it. You do come across as quite trustworthy for me talking to you. And then you hear this other narrative. It's just we live in a world where it is enormously difficult to know what's true or and what's not, and when you don't have direct access to people, it's even harder, right? What are you going to
100%.
believe?
No, I mean, I don't believe much that I hear about or read about, I'll tell you, or at least I really try to keep an open mind, because I just know how much things can be distorted. And anytime it seems like a story or a narrative benefits like either the government or some organization, like I'm even more suspicious, like kind of the ways that like BLM hijacked these, tragedies, or ways that even the Me Too movement kind of made it seem like, every woman was being like raped as they walked down the street. Like it just, I try to be critical. I still make mistakes. I still like, I'll believe things and then meet someone and be like, oh my God, like but I'm more open to the, like, I'm open to information.
Yeah.
So, and that's
Well,
all I
what's
can
the
hope for
cure?
people. What's that?
What's the cure for this? Is
What's
there
the,
a cure for this?
well, I think just questioning, like, what other alternatives could there be? And I know, watching something like The Vow, it's really hard because it's well done in the sense that, not that it's even that entertaining, because honestly, I found it kind of long and boring, but the music, the graphics, the storytelling, the slow motion, and like they use all of these mechanisms to affect your emotions. And I watched it and I wanted to be sick. I was like, this is horrible. But at the same time, I also know the facts. I've seen, I'm, in a fortunate position to have access to a lot more evidence than almost anyone has seen. So I know what's true and what's not. And, I think it's the fact that people can rewrite history to serve their current position is very tricky. And it's kind of like the same thing as what you were saying, like someone in a position of power can abuse that power. They can use it to, convince people that they need to do things for their own good, but it's really to serve them. Or they can be, a leader who understands that responsibility and truly wants to help people. Same with people who are victimized or people who benefit from telling a story that they were victimized. And you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like you can't say all leaders are corrupt or not. You can't say all victims are liars or not. But we do need to be able to ask questions. And I think that's a red flag. Like if you can't challenge a narrative without being attacked, that's a problem. And that's what you see in our case, is anyone who dared even ask a question or say that they had a good experience with NXIVM or with Keith was automatically attacked, canceled. Like I am maybe the prime example of that because I've never been accused of anything. There's not one person who's come out and said, Nicki did this bad thing to me. Okay, I've obviously never been charged with a crime, but I have come out and told what I believe to be true. And for the most part, spoken about due process and, generally like women's responsibility, taking responsibility for their choices and things like that. And I am called a rape apologist. I'm called a sex trafficker. I'm called a brainwasher, like I'm called danger, like the worst things that you can be that are the antithesis of who I am.
Yeah.
Just because I ask questions and I say something different than what's out there. So I think being conscious of that, being open, remembering like also we're all human at the end of the day, and not being mean to people because of what you read about them on the internet. But I don't know if there's an easy cure. I think sometimes it takes like going through it to really understand the problem.
In what way do you think this has changed you?
Well, it's interesting because, I think when I took ESP in the beginning, I was searching for ways to be better, to be a person who was principled. And I was like, I'm like a Canadian actor. Like, how am I ever gonna like stand for anything? Careful what you wish for, because I think that I've been able to kind of be faced with challenges and a type of prejudice that I never experienced before in my life, that has really given me so much compassion for people who, just because of their circumstances, because of their beliefs, the color of their skin, are met with tremendous discrimination and hate. So I feel very like privileged for that gift, even though it's been, hard to kind of earn it. Like I said, I'm just way more skeptical of any story or narrative that's out there. But I'm also stronger in many ways. I'm happier. Like I have real problems to deal with, and so like I don't really have room for drama, or to create problems where there are none. So I feel my goal in all this is just to like share what I've learned as much as possible to help people who might find themselves in similar situations, either being canceled or in prison. I talk to a lot of people in prison. And yeah, I think it's just made me a stronger, more resilient person. Like I used to go to an audition, and if I would do a bad job, I would be depressed for like a week, like and now, I can't even tell you the stuff that I go through every day. And, I'm happy. I have a great life.
Well, one other thing that I think I've seen you called is brainwashed, and I think it's pretty evident that you're pretty far from that. And I think to be able to stand up to people, whether we 100% agree on everything or not, to be able to just kind of stand up to people and to stand up for what you believe to be true when people are going so hard against you, when the narratives are so set against you, I think it is such a virtue. And very few people are able to do that. And it is such a strength. So I very much admire that. And to find that, I mean, I think we're sort of tested. We don't often know what we're capable of until we have to face that kind of stuff. And sometimes we're surprised. We think sometimes we can't do that. And we find that we can when we are facing that.
Certainly.
I mean,
yeah. And you can't, at least I know for me, like I couldn't have done it alone. Like I have an amazing support system, my family, friends who've stood by me throughout this. So, and that's kind of like a big reason why I'm so outspoken is that I know a lot of people do feel alone when they're either attacked or they have beliefs that are unpopular. And I just, I want them to know that they're not crazy. They're not from another planet, even though it feels like it sometimes, and they're not alone.
It's funny. My last question to you was actually what words of advice you would give to somebody going through this, and you pretty much just answered it. So,
sure. Actually, well, I realized that I didn't fully answer your previous question because we got off on a tangent. So, if you don't mind, I'll quickly sum up the case and let people know that. So, Keith was convicted after a 6-week trial. Like I said, this alleged child pornography evidence was like the linchpin. And since the trial, it's been discovered by 7, I think 7, yeah, maybe 8, but forensic experts, 4 of them former FBI agents who've looked at the evidence and analyzed it and found so many issues with it and determined that what they called child pornography, which was several photos of a nude woman, and the government alleged that because of the dates on the photos, that meant she was 15 years old. And all of these forensic experts have determined those were planted, fabricated, all sorts of issues with the hard drive, with the photos themselves, the metadata was manipulated. So right now, there's a motion in the district court, a Rule 33 motion, which is a motion for new trial based on this evidence. So it should be explosive. It should be a no-brainer. Unfortunately, as you alluded to with the media narrative and what's out there, people are just like, he's guilty, lock him up. And some people think, they don't care if the FBI planted evidence because he's such a monster. But I think if people really understood what they used to justify the other charges and the principle of justice, that there's no way you can justify framing someone. I don't care how bad you think they are, but that corrupts the whole system. So I don't
have to like him to believe in justice. So absolutely. I mean, I do find that terrifying if metadata and all that stuff was indeed planted, that is explosive, as you said, that the FBI would actually do that completely undermines the entire justice system. That means there is no such thing in a way if specifically the FBI would do that is pretty terrifying.
Indeed.
Yeah. Wow. That's very interesting. Wow. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you talking to me, and even before we talked, I did say that, hey, I'll push back, and you were willing to chat with me anyways, and that I think is a great testament to you. So I appreciate that especially, and I think we need. I've been calling this series kind of like a forbidden conversations, and some of it is things that I'm afraid to talk about. But I think we need more of that because as a society, this is what we need to do. We need to have more conversations about topics and especially things that often are presented just from one angle. So I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I hope this wasn't too painful.
Not at all. It was very enjoyable, and I appreciate you pushing back and also being open. So I really appreciate also what you're doing with these conversations, because I think it's important that we can share our views, whether we agree or not, but also be respectful and hopefully walk away having learned something or have something new to contemplate.
Absolutely. And what's next for you, by the way?
So I am still really involved with trying to help the legal efforts and expose the truth, through the court system. But I also have my own Substack, Nicki Clyne Substack. I always get the order reversed, but if you search Nicki Clyne on Twitter, I have a locals, Instagram, all that stuff. I also have a group, a YouTube channel, and a website with women from DOS. Actually, 8 of us, which I'm pretty sure outnumbers the ones claiming to be victims, who are publicly speaking about our experience and what DOS was really about. And even beyond that, just speaking for women's empowerment, and how accountability and discipline and responsibility can really help you be empowered and grow. So that's called the Dossier Project. Also, getting back into acting. So that's kind of fun.
Oh, good.
And
Yeah.
And who knows what else. So yeah.
That sounds great. I will make sure to also link all of that. And I think the media project that you had going before, I hope that you can restore that at some point, because I think that's very, very much needed. That's something I think about a lot. So anything to do with media literacy, I'm a huge fan of.
100%. Well, maybe we can talk about
Let's
it.
talk. Yeah, let's talk. I'm all in. That's what I
Cool.
want.
Awesome.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
My pleasure.